Hello and welcome to the Fight for Liberty show. Today's show is dedicated to one of the beacons of hope left in Washington, Rand Paul. As a literal child of the Ron Paul Revolution, Rand has been sticking up for liberty a lot longer than he's been in Washington. So today, we're going to do a few deep dives into legislation he's written, we'll cover some causes he's been a part of, and I'll give you a rundown of his story in What's Up Washington. So don't go anywhere, grab a drink, roll a blunt, sit back and relax, because the fight, it's just begun.
Shut up and sit down.
I could talk about Rand Paul all day. So choosing what to cover today took all of my decision-making power. I still have no idea what I want for dinner yesterday. But my choice to keep the conversation recent was aided immensely when Rand dropped almost a dozen new bills off in the last few weeks. These bills talk about everything from retirement to police reform, so we have plenty to choose from. We're going to start off with some of his earlier contributions from this year, and it's a double feature. On March 21st, Senator Paul introduced S. 3557 and S. 3558. Now, if you're in the financial world like me, I'll be making another video in a few weeks that will go more in depth on both of these bills, along with a few others. But today, I'm going to try to keep the Wall Street talk to a minimum. So we're going to start off with S. 3557, which doesn't have a short title. So the title is a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to terminate required minimum distributions under tax-favored retirement plans. Or more simply put, to get rid of mandatory minimum distributions. Now, for those of you that don't know, the IRS has a list of required distributions where you have to take money out of your retirement fund. Now, this could be for multiple reasons, whether it's your age, your employment status, death in the family, or plenty of other reasons. Now, this sounds like a weird thing to both exist and to be fighting against, right? And the government is telling you you have to take your money. So you might be asking, why? Well, it's because the government needs to continue to tax the money that it takes for you to live. If you are living off of money that has already been taxed, such as what's in your savings account, the government is not making any money off of you surviving. For this reason, they force you to take money off of the untaxed savings plans because that money is taxed when you take it out. This way, they are able to continue their budget of living off of what you're living off of. So now that you know why Section 401A9 of the Internal Revenue Code exists, we can talk about the solution found in Rand Paul's bill. Section 1 gets right to work. It's titled Termination of Required Minimum Distribution Rules. And it says quite simply that the requirements in this paragraph shall not apply for any calendar year after 2019. That's subsection A. Just get rid of it. Subsection B protects rollover distributions against the rules laid out in Section 401A9. This just means that the government still can't force you to use the money when you don't want to. Section C finishes it off with listing the effective dates for this legislation. It says, in general, it would apply for calendar years beginning after December 31st, 2019. Now, it does, however, give a little bit of time for contracts and pension plans to catch up, basically until January 1st, 2020. Unless you work in the government, that is, then you get an extra year, which makes sense because we all know the government is the last employer to catch up with the times. Now, it also cuts off amendments made to these plans after December 31st, 2020. So it gives kind of a staggered timeline for people to get their shit together. This bill illustrates one of the things I love most about Rand Paul, Almost everything he writes fits the mold of the One Subject at a Time Act, because that's it. That's S3557. It's over. Now we get to move on to an even better, shorter bill, S3558. This bill pits two of the biggest financial regulation agencies in the country against each other. It's titled A Bill to Require the Securities and Exchange Commission to prevent the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority from enforcing a certain rule of that authority. Vague title, I know, but we'll explain. This bill is literally only one page. That's with the entire first half being taken up by the typical BS and posturing that bills have to have. So I'll read the entire bill for you. Section 1. Prevention of Enforcement of Rule. Beginning on the date of enactment of this act, the Securities and Exchange Commission shall prevent the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, referred to in this section as FINRA, from enforcing Rule 3110C of FINRA, relating to internal inspections. Yep, that's it. I'm done. That's the whole bill. Now I'm sure you're asking what Rule 3110C of FINRA is. Well, guess what? I'll tell you. This section is labeled Internal Inspections. For those of you that have worked in a finance career, you know these regulations all too well. These are the guidelines by which you have to operate your business so that if you get audited, they have nice, neat records to look through. Now, I'm not going to read the entire section because that would be crazy. Just know that these regulations cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for some of even the smallest financial firms. When you really look down into it, these regulations are forcing you to pay someone for the job description of aiding and abetting armed robbery. Because that's what it is when the federal government decides it gets to take a slice of the pie you made just because it wants to. And because of these rules, you have to pay to help them. Now, the second act here definitely only affects a smaller number of people, but the first one affects everyone. There are so many regulations on how you can and can't plan for your retirement, how you get to spend your money, where your money gets to sit while you're living, and where it goes when you die. When did it become okay for the government to control every aspect of our financial lives? In these acts, Rand Paul finally says enough. Now, these don't fix all the problems, of course, but they're a start. They're a step in the right direction. If we can start regaining control of our finances, we can finally start to regain control of our lives. As we look through this week in the news, another tragic story of a life taken too soon by police officers is unable to be looked over. Although this happened almost a year ago, the national outcry against police brutality has brought this back to the forefront, and for good reason. 23-year-old Elijah McClain was walking back from the store with an iced tea for his brother when Aurora, Colorado police officers stopped him, claiming they got reports of a suspicious person. According to the officers, McClain, who wasn't even suspected of a crime, quote, resisted arrest, which led to the officers performing a carotid hold, which caused Elijah to vomit. Then they had EMTs inject ketamine into McClain, causing him to have a heart attack in the ambulance. He eventually passed away a few days later in the hospital. This story is chilling enough as it is, but wait until you hear this poor kid's last words. I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name is Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different. That's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Wait, why are you attacking me? I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat. But I don't judge people who do eat meat. Forgive me. All I was trying to do was become better. I will do it. I will do anything. Sacrifice my identity. I'll do it. You all are phenomenal. You are beautiful and I love you. Try to forgive me. I'm a mood Gemini. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ow, that really hurt. You're very strong. Teamwork makes the dream work. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe correctly. These were the last words of a completely innocent kid. That last part, apologizing for throwing up on the officer when he had him in a chokehold. Now, of course, these officers were cleared of all wrongdoing and are still on the force. There was a violin vigil in honor of Elijah, who used to play violin for cats in the shelter. That's how perfect this kid was. And this is where the story goes from terrible to just plain evil. The Aurora PD broke up this peaceful vigil with rubber bullets and tear gas. No prompting, no violence. People were standing around playing violin and got shot at. How is this still being allowed? How do we keep letting this happen? This needs to stop today. If our elected officials won't put an end to this, the people will. We are not going to let France out-protest us. So with that in mind, let's check in on the defund police movement. In New York City, faculty and students from across the city penned a letter to Speaker Corey Johnson and the entire New York City Council this week, demanding that a $1 billion cut from the NYPD's funding. These signatures included distinguished professors from NYU, Columbia, CUNY, and even some SUNY schools, along with a vast, diverse population of students. Now, if you live in New York or have been to New York recently, you know how OP the NYPD is. They have actual tanks. They are one of the largest militaries in the world. Let that sink in. The NYPD could win a war with multiple countries. We don't need that. I'm asking New York City Council to heed the warnings of these scholars and cut the NYPD back a bit. Now, speaking of dirty cops, Kamala Harris is making headway as the frontrunner for Joe Biden's VP pick. Now, this is the perfect team. The man who wrote mass incarceration into existence, teaming up with the person who used his laws to get free labor for the state of California. Now, I could talk shit about Kamala for hours, but I'll never do it as well as Tulsi does here.
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. That would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Senator Harris, your response.
As the elected Attorney General of California, I did the work of significantly reforming the criminal justice system of a state of 40 million people, which became a national model for the work that needs to be done. And I am proud of that work. And I am proud of making a decision to not just give fancy speeches or be in a legislative body and give speeches on the floor, but actually doing the work of being in the position to use the power that I had to reform a system that is badly in need of reform. That is why we created initiatives that were about reentering former offenders and getting them counseling. It is why, and because I know that criminal justice system is so broken, that I am an advocate for what we need to do to not only decriminalize, but legalize marijuana in the United States.
I want to bring Congresswoman Gabbard back in. Your response,
The bottom line is, Senator Harris, when you are in a position to make a difference and an impact in these people's lives, you did not. And worse yet, in the case of those who are on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them until you were forced to do so. There is no excuse for that. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology.
I love that. I could watch that over and over and over again all day. Now, Harris would be the worst possible choice for VP, but the Democrats aren't going to listen to me. And as for Joe Biden, in the words of Lin-Manuel Miranda, You're in worse shape than the national debt is in. Now, speaking for idiots running for president, Donald Trump has an arrest warrant out for murder and terrorism. Right? This came from the country of Iran. They said that they would fully prosecute Trump as soon as he leaves office of the president, and it has asked Interpol for help in detaining Trump, along with 35 others named in the warrant. This is all in retaliation for the murder and assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general. I think this is a completely warranted response, if you ask me. We assassinated one of their generals. Why wouldn't they retaliate? Now, speaking of escalating things to a ridiculous level, on Sunday, a group of protesters broke into a gated community to march for Black Lives Matter in St. Louis, Missouri. They were met by a lawyer couple with a pistol and an AR-15. Now, the public has lashed out at this couple for their hostility, but let's get something straight here. These people were trespassing. When you start breaking private property laws, you are no longer peaceful protesters. These people never left their property and didn't even fire a warning shot. The protesters continued to march through the gated neighborhood anyway, but nobody got hurt. Nobody damaged any property. Win-win. If it would have been cops, people would have been shot. We've seen that over and over and over again in the last few months. This is a story about armed citizens being a much better solution than police officers. This is the case most of the time. School shootings, armed robbery, kidnapping, you name it. Armed citizens are better than cops. Now, let's be fair here, though. These people are not showing what responsible gun ownership looks like. They are not a model citizen by any stretch of the imagination. They're complete morons. The guy has his sling around his waist, and his wife looks like she's auditioning for an 80s rap video. Like, come on. But now that we've discussed some of the biggest morons in the country, let's switch gears and talk about someone with a brain between their ears in this week's segment of What's Up, Washington? Welcome to What's Up, Washington. Now, this entire episode has been about our favorite senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. So let's get to know him a bit better. This 57-year-old ophthalmologist was elected in 2010 after a highly competitive Republican primary. But as with most of the greats, his fight for freedom did not begin in Washington. He was born in Pittsburgh and moved to Texas early on in life, where his father served as a representative in Washington. Interestingly enough, he went by Randy at this time. He didn't even earn the nickname Rand until he was married, and his wife is who gave it to him. A lot of people think he was named after Ayn Rand because of his father's libertarian leanings, but that's actually not true. He dipped his toes into the water of politics early on, taking a semester off of his college education to work on his dad's failed Senate campaign in 1984. It wasn't a victory, and it started the elder Paul's 12-year hiatus from politics, but it gave Rand his first experience of what a campaign trail was like. He returned to politics in 1996 along with Ron when he managed his dad's campaign to rejoin the House of Representatives. This outcome was drastically different, and the father-son team went on to defeat incumbent Greg Laughlin, who had endorsements from both George W. Bush and Newt Gingrich. Rand maintained his fight for fiscal conservatism outside Washington, founding the Kentucky Taxpayers Union in 1994, which kept track of elected officials' votes on spending and taxes, and assisted in lobbying efforts, inviting politicians to sign a pledge in favor of low taxes and low spending. A rebel always, he got fed up with the new policies of the American Board of Ophthalmology, and along with a few colleagues created the National Board of Ophthalmology in 1997. The goal was to offer a cheaper crediting system with lifetime certifications and a more modern test. Now, students who took the NBO certification said the test was probably harder and certainly more clinically relevant than what the ABO would have had them take. Unfortunately, this was never considered an official crediting agency and really only took off in states like Kentucky, where national accreditation is not needed to practice. Speculation started early on that he would eventually run for Senate, especially with his last name commanding so much respect. So after Jim Bunning announced he would not run for re-election, Rand announced his candidacy, running against then Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson, who was supported by most of the Republicans in D.C. Rand ran a wonderful grassroots campaign, raising a ridiculous amount of money, and ended up beating Grayson by a 32% margin. He then went on to face another appointed official of Kentucky, Attorney General Jack Conway, winning with 56% of the vote. Upon his arrival in Washington, Rand wasted no time pushing drastic legislation and pissing off every establishment hack he came across. He spoke out adamantly against the warhawk nature of President Barack Obama, heavily criticizing the interference in Libya and Syria. He spoke out against interference in Ukraine until Russia began military action, at which time he still only suggested sanctions and diplomatic efforts. Now, us libertarians, we get a bad reputation as isolationists or nationalists, but this isn't the case. We just prefer diplomacy over war in every situation that it can possibly be achieved. Still early in his career, he worked to block a treaty with Switzerland that would have enabled the IRS to conduct tax evasion probes. Now, I don't know what we could have offered Switzerland that would have led them to getting rid of that entire industry in their country, but damn, it must have been a sweet deal. Rand somehow went on to win the Distinguished Service Award for his work on public policy from the Center for the National Interest, which was formerly called the Nixon Center. He's the only person that could win an award named after the most Orwellian person in our government's history for working to block the IRS and the CIA. Rand even took a swing at the way we do arms trading with the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, which he wrote with Tulsi Gabbard and sponsored in the Senate. She sponsored it in the House of Representatives, along with Thomas Massie, Mike Lee, and others. But we'll deep dive into that one in a few weeks. As of August 2018, he had voted with Trump 74% of the time, the least of all Republican senators. One of those times he voted with Trump was opposing a bill that would impose sanctions against Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Trump argued that these sanctions were coming at the worst possible time when our relationships with these countries could not take the hit. Paul, along with Massie, Amash, John Duncan, and Bernie Sanders, thought that there was a more diplomatic option to the situation. Now, Senator Paul was called out by John McCain, who accused him of being a Russian agent. How many times have we heard that one? And I love Rand's response. He said, John McCain, quote, makes a really, really strong case for term limits. Obama called him out for strongly being against taxes, which doesn't sound like a problem to me. But when you're a tax and spend war hawk, they're kind of important. So even Mitt Romney took a swing at him for criticizing President Trump, saying that it was a bad look for the Republican Party and that they needed to show unity. There was speculation of a presidential run since 2013, and in 2016 he did run, pushing a platform of fiscal responsibility, sensibility, and peace. Sadly, he dropped out shortly after Iowa, where he placed 5th out of 12, and I think he's one of the only 2016 Republican candidates that I still see bumper stickers for, other than Trump, of course. He really gave a lot of hope for the people that care about their freedoms and their liberties in their everyday life. He had a lot of crossover with the Tulsi Gabbard campaign in 2020, and it's sad that constitutionally based, service-minded candidates are always considered fringe, but that seems to have been the case for quite some time. I myself am looking forward to a possible 2024 presidential race, but I'd love to see him just about anywhere in the executive branch. If we're playing Madden politics, I'd probably have him Secretary of State, maybe Secretary of Defense. But back to reality. This year, he made waves as one of the first people in Washington to contract COVID-19. There was speculation as to how long he knew of his diagnosis before beginning quarantine, but it's all hearsay. Personally, I don't care. If he was trying to give the Senate corona, I would consider that a service to this nation. After he made a full recovery, he went and volunteered at a local hospital in Bowling Green, Kentucky. helping them withstand the rush of patients in the early months of the virus. While most senators were hiding in their houses trying to decide if they could vote from home, my man was out there volunteering on the front lines. Now, he is unfortunately still a Republican and has come down on the wrong side in a few cases, in my opinion, but he's doing good work. He calls himself a libertarian regularly and acts the part. So, my call to action for you is this. Call his office in Bowling Green and tell him to change his party affiliation. The number is 270-782-8303. That's 270-782-8303. We have a mosh. If we could get a libertarian in each House of Congress, we could see a real seed change in the way people view the party. Now, thanks for watching, and tune in next week to ask, what's up, Washington? On our next deep dive, we start to tackle the difficult task of cleaning up the way our government functions. We look first at S 3904, also known as the Write the Laws Act. The long title for this bill wonderfully fits the One Subject at a Time Act and lists out just about everything this act does. In fact, the title makes the 11 pages of this bill seem almost unnecessary. In short, it says, a bill to end the unconstitutional delegation of legislative power. So this is Congress trying to rein back its power, which has been unconstitutionally given away to different committees or people within the executive and judicial branches. Section 2 gives its constitutional authority statement, which will become important in about 10 minutes as we get into our next deep dive. But this expresses that both Section 1 and Section 8 of Article 1 of the United States Constitution gives Congress the authority to write this bill. Section 3 begins a list of congressional findings. There are 14, so I'm only going to talk about a few. This act quotes some of the greatest people in American political history, from Chief Justice John Marshall to Chief Justice Melville Fuller. Even President James Madison gets a shout out here. That one I'm actually going to read to you. The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. This quote comes out of the Federalist Papers number 47. These were the original documents written to defend our Constitution and prove that the American experiment could succeed if done right. Rand Paul brings these ideas up because he feels we have not done it right, and that's why the experiment is seeming to fail. James Madison would be disgusted if he saw the country the way we have it right now. And before you give me any shit about Madison being the bad guy in the play, Hamilton would hate this country too. The rest of the findings have to do with examples of legislative power that have been delegated. The quotes are also pretty good, so I would encourage you to look this bill up and read it through. Section 4 is titled Restoring the Separation of Powers. This is where we get into the nitty-gritty of the bill, and we start to improve our government. It amends Title I of the U.S. Code by inserting 3 new sections and at the end of Chapter 2. These are titled Non-Delegation of Legislative Power, Enforcement Clause, and Applicability. Title 151, Non-Delegation of Legislative Power. This title would prohibit any act of Congress that contained any delegation of legislative power. It also gets rid of the presidential executive actions. This is the most common way that we see the executive branch use powers it shouldn't have. It does give one exemption, that the executive branch can delegate authority to make factual findings that would determine the date upon which an act is implemented, suspended, or received. Now, I think that's an okay exemption because the executive branch can have this task from time to time, and that makes sense. Subsection D gives us a very interesting piece. It says, no later than 6 months after the date of enactment of this chapter, The Comptroller General of the United States shall submit to Congress a report identifying all statutes which contain any delegation of legislative powers prohibited under this section. So not only are we rolling back the ability to delegate power, we're also doing a deep exploration into the inner workings of our federal government and finding out other unconstitutional delegations of power. This is brilliant. We move on to Title 152, the Enforcement Clause. This basically negates any act of Congress or presidential directive or rule or regulation that doesn't comply with what we just talked about. It says it has no force or effect and no legal action may be brought under such an act. Then it gives us the ability to sue the government if we think they're enforcing an act that violates this section. Finishes up by adding Title 153 effective date, which is basically immediately. And then it finishes with Section E at the end containing a severability clause. Now, I'm sure we'll talk about these quite often in the future, or the opposite, which is a non-severability clause. A non-severability clause was used to ramrod the voting thresholds for third parties in New York State through the Assembly. These state that any part of the bill is deemed unconstitutional, the whole bill goes out the window. In the case of New York State, this makes people hesitant to challenge the vote thresholds because they were attached to a much-needed budget along with campaign finance bill that most of the Assembly wanted. Here we have the exact opposite. This bill says that if anything in this act is held to be invalid for any reason, the remainder of this act shall not be affected. So even if you find one thing wrong with this bill, you don't get to scrap it. The establishment in Washington would have to chip away at this bill piece by piece. But it's currently sitting in the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. First of all, why is this one committee? Homeland Security should be a totally separate thing from this conversation. Secondly, why does every substantial bill get sent to a committee for years to die? Can't we just agree that this would be good for our country and vote on it? According to the Library of Congress, there are currently no co-sponsors in the Senate. But as we'll discuss in a bit, Senator Paul is working with a few members of the House of Representatives on some of these projects. So I would be surprised if we don't see a similar bill land on the House floor soon. Included in this drop of legislation is S 3845, which is the Senate version of the One Subject at a Time Act. Now, if you've been watching this show for any amount of time, you know what this bill is about. You know how strongly I believe in it and what it stands for. You know what good it could do for our country. But in case you're new, let me give you a rundown. This bill would force Congress to hold each piece of legislation to only one subject. It would make them clearly define what they were trying to do in the title of each piece of legislation. Then it voids everything that doesn't comply. This makes Congress unable to sneak crazy things into unrelated laws and push them past us without us knowing. I have to shout out Senator Paul for introducing this game-changing piece of legislation to the United States Senate. If you want to learn more about the One Subject at a Time Act, you can go to fiteforliberty.com/onesubject and read the bill and take a look at our pledge. We're trying to get a coalition of legislators that would change the world, and we would love to have you with us on that mission. We're going to continue our mission of fixing the legislature with S 3879, the Read the Bills Act. The long title for this is quite short, so I'll read it. It says, "A bill to preserve the constitutional authority of Congress and ensure accountability and transparency in legislation." This one also begins with a Section 2 as a constitutional authority statement. It cites Sections 5, 7, and 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution as legal grounds for being able to write this bill. Since all this bill is doing is reverting the government back to the Constitution, I don't see it necessary for you to read these. If you're curious, I'd encourage you to look them up, though. In fact, you should probably read the entire Constitution cover to cover. It'll help you immensely in life. Section 3 is the findings again, and I like how it starts out. Number 1, the Constitution of the United States vests all legislative powers granted therein in Congress. This is basically what we covered in the Write the Laws Act. Number 2, each member of Congress is elected by the people whom the member is accountable, and members must represent the people of their respective state or district in exercising their legislative power. Now, I only wish that this were actually true. This bill is based off of a very utopian view of the Constitution, but it's basically how the Constitution was originally meant to be read. It also discusses the requirements in the Manual of Parliamentary Practice, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. This requires the Senate to read the entire bill 3 times and the House to read it twice before it goes to a vote. Now, that's a gross oversimplification of the original requirements, but it goes on to say that Congress has basically completely foregone these practices. It even points out that in the last 6 days of a session of Congress, a resolution can vote for passage if it's not even written yet. So it's clearly not read through and definitely not 3 times. Section 4 finally explains the constitutional authority statement. This requires all bills to contain one of these. If it also includes a failure to comply piece, which negates all laws that would be passed that don't contain a specific provision citing the powers granted to Congress in the Constitution to make the law. That obviously would cut out about 90% of what Congress does because they don't have the constitutional authority to do most of what they do. The Read the Bills Act then includes a provision that requires the text of a bill to contain the current law. This would make my research significantly easier. It would make everything that's referenced in the bill have to be in the bill. No more Googling 100 different pieces of legislation and sections of the U.S. Code just to make one of these videos. After that, it requires the section of law as it would read as modified to be written in the bill as well. This also includes a failure to comply clause that would not allow the bill to go to vote on final passage unless it complied with this act. We then move on to the procedures prior to the vote on a bill or resolution. This section is here to ensure as much transparency and logical voting and accurate representation as we can possibly get. It starts off requiring the full text of a bill be published at least 7 days before the vote. Then it requires a public notice of the specific calendar week in which the vote is scheduled. It then requires the clerk of the House or the secretary of the Senate to read the bill verbatim to each House of Congress with a constitutionally required quorum. The only exception to the reading of this bill is if it's already passed both houses and it's just coming back for reconsideration. That would mean that it's already been heard in the entirety once because it already passed. The next part is kind of interesting because it only has to do with people voting in favor of the passage of a bill. It says that anyone voting in favor has to sign an affidavit saying they were either present through an entire reading of a bill and listened attentively, or they read it attentively to themselves. Then it reiterates that if you vote against the bill, you don't have to do this. I'm not sure if I agree with that piece, but I love the rest of the bill. All of these sections finish off with a no waiver or modification clause. This states that neither House of Congress can modify the requirements set forth in this section. It says it in a lot more words than that to negate any form of loopholes possible, but they cannot change this at all. It stays forever. It finishes up its additions to the U.S. Code with an enforcement clause that says an act of Congress that doesn't comply with sections 105A, 105B, or 105C shall have no force or effect, and no legal, equitable, regulatory, civil, or criminal action may be brought under such an act of Congress. So just like everything else Rand or the other libertarian members of Congress usually write, this negates everything that would break this law. But all laws should be like this. We should not allow legislation to pass that breaks laws. Right? How is this not common sense? It then gives us the authority to bring an action against the government if we are aggrieved by the failure of our representative to adhere to the section of this act. I love how often Rand, Massey, Amash, and the likes, they add this section to their bill. We should 100% be able to take them to court if they break their own laws. Rand finishes up with a severability clause, which we discussed earlier, so that even if they find something wrong with a tiny piece of this, the rest of it stays. And once it's passed, the cronies in Washington would have to chip away to get back to their bullshit, smoke and mirror show of politicking that they do. It's pretty clear by now that Congress does not work for the American people anymore. They work for the special interests, the lobbyists, and the deep-pocketed string holders of Washington. Rand Paul is fighting a losing battle here, trying to regain some of that power and trying to ensure at least some level of transparency within our federal government. Unfortunately, these bills will probably go nowhere. They're too busy trying to make Washington, D.C. a state. The only hope we have is to elect the revolution. We need more people in Washington on our side of this fight. Senator Paul needs reinforcements. You can go to our website and get more information about our fight to freedom within politics. And if you want to get involved on the front lines, you can go to campaignsforliberty.com and fill out the form. From there, we'll hook you up with a campaign or a lobbying effort in the name of freedom. Together, we can change the country. I'm headed out to Michigan in a couple of days to work on the front lines, knocking doors for liberty. If you're interested in something like that, please reach out. I'm super excited to be able to play a part in the revolution, and I want everybody that can and wants to be able to feel what I get to feel on a daily basis. So please reach out. Follow me on Twitter at DavidFite, at Fight for Liberty. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, and stay up to date. Reach out. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to get you involved. I'd love to hear your story on how you came to watching the show, how you came to the Liberty Movement, and let's fucking win, right? We have quite a few months till November to get our shit together and push through some drastic changes in our local, state, and federal government this year. So let's do it. Until next time, thanks for watching, and keep up the fight. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you missed it, go watch our live show from this week. You can also follow us on Instagram or Twitter at Fight for Liberty and support the channel at patreon.com/fightforliberty. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next week.